Thank you, Andrea. And dear friends, thank you to Atelier, Populaire and Palestinerleir for inviting me here. I have been asked to talk about refugees, protection and asylum seen from a European perspective. I have, for the last 5 years, led an organisation called the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, which consists of 70 non-governmental organisations from 30 different European countries. We deal a lot with the European institutions, the European Parliament, the European Commission, and with the interior ministers in all the member states of the EU. In Norway we have members such as the Norwegian Refugee Council and the Norwegian Organisation for Asylum Seekers. A lot was said during Trygve's presentation, and a lot of the questions that were put to him afterwards, I think, goes to the core of the issues that are not unique for Norway, but is a trend throughout Europe today. So I'll turn my presentation around a little bit, and I will start with a quote from the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was at one point very frustrated over his bureaucrats or his civil servants. And he said, civil servants, no longer servants, no longer civil. Today I would like to turn that around and say it's the politicians that are no longer servants and no longer civil. Because a politician, in my point of view, has two purposes. He should represent the people, or she, or he or she should also lead the people. When it comes to questions of migration, of asylum, of protecting vulnerable people in need of protection, it's leadership we need, and that's what we lack in Europe. That's the bottom line of it. What's happened in the European Union? Well, it was started with the Second World War as a backdrop, and it was built on basic values of human rights, of civil liberties, and with the notion that nobody should be persecuted again in Europe because of what happened during the Second World War. But that should be universal. As you know, the European Union started mostly as an economic partnership, but it developed also into cooperation in the field of justice and home affairs after a big meeting of all the presidents and prime ministers in Finland in 1999. Then we should build a Europe of asylum. We should build a Europe based on justice, freedom and security. After that, something happened, I think, that changed the spirit of what these European leaders said then in 1999, where asylum was very much at the forefront, protection was very much at the forefront. Two things, I think, happened. First, you had 9/11, and security, of course, became a huge issue. Then you had the enlargement of the European Union, where a lot of the Western European states were afraid that they would be overwhelmed with people from the new member states. And in many ways, the focus since the justice, freedom, and in freedom and in justice, we have protection, we have human rights, we have asylum, and we have refugees, was pushed aside and the focus remained on security. An anecdote I addressed about 2 years ago now, a very different fora than I'm doing today. It was almost 1,000 hired men and women serving in the border guards of Europe. They're mostly in uniform as well, so as a person with a non-governmental background, I wasn't really used to that sort of an audience. But it was on the occasion of the 5-year jubilee of Frontex, the European Border Guard Coordination Service, and the director for the Border Guard Service, a thing called and he addressed all the border guards in Europe. And then he said, you know how many there are of you? There's 400,000. The year before, there was about 200,000 asylum claims lodged in the EU of 27 states. So it's just a picture where you can imagine that on each side of every asylum seeker, you have 2 border guards. And then the rhetorics, on the other hand, from the political leadership, is that we're being overwhelmed. That is absolutely not the case. 3 years ago, the numbers of asylum seekers to Europe was at a 20-year low. On the contrary, when we did receive, back in the 90s, when we had the Yugoslavia crisis, when we did receive a lot of refugees, and then we were talking about tens of thousands coming, then there was a totally different support also in the population. You can speculate on what has happened and whether it was the composition of that group of refugees. But when we now, a year ago, saw that, or 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when we had a crisis close to Europe with refugees from Iraq, and now, more recently, with the so-called Arab Spring that was much applauded by Europe, the focus was not on giving protection to those who needed it, but protect Europe itself. And that is a dramatic and categorical shift that I think I've seen being even become stronger and stronger during the last 5 years I've worked with these issues as well. One example, some of you might remember this, was that in the very beginning, everybody knew what was going to happen because there was uprising in Tunisia and in Libya, in Egypt and so forth. So it was all predictable that some people would flee and some people would need protection in neighboring states for a period. But what happened was that 3,000 Tunisians came to Italy, and they were made into a huge political game between France and Italy about these 3,000 people that lasted forever. At the same time, Tunisia itself had more than 10,000 people coming over their border every day from Libya. They never closed their borders. 90% of these people were living with Tunisian host families. So the discrepancies and the hypocrisy in that sort of politics, I think, has been striking, and it's been particularly striking the last few years. There is a politics of fear, and Tulip mentioned it already. There's a politic of fear where we see in Europe today that international crime, people trafficking, human smuggling, terrorism, all of this is mixed together. And migration is not seen as the phenomenon it is, a natural phenomenon that will never stop, but it's seen as a part of a security problem. So we're criminalizing more and more people trying to come here. At the same time, there's another paradox, and that's the fact that every day into Europe arrives 1 million, and this is also quite telling for the way that it's treated in the European Union, so-called third country citizens arrives legally. And we're also dependent on people coming to work here for the future. So the tiny number of asylum seekers, because it is really low, makes comes out of proportions and becomes mixed up with the security issues, and it's very close to getting criminalized. And this is something that is the real worrying trend, and this is what we're battling with, whatever we try to say about rights, about conventions. I talk to many ministers of interior or justice in Europe, and it's not like I can sit there and say, yes, what about the 51 Convention and so on. I tell the people who I work with, who are legal experts and write my speeches, I say there's no point, because I have to appeal to other things to get through. Because it's not like they've forgotten about it, they just don't care about it anymore. And this is the backdrop that we're struggling with. The Human Rights Commissioner for Council of Europe, a Swede called Thomas Hammarberg, a number of years ago, when Norway changed its policies, because there was a radical shift in Norway as well, he said even nice Norway had turned nasty. And Scandinavia used to be among the countries in Europe that would resettle refugees and would have higher rates of recognition of refugees comparably in Europe. But now what's happened is that there's become this game between the European states of not making themselves attractive to refugees. So it's about becoming slightly stricter than your neighbour, so that they won't come here, but they might go there instead. But they have to go somewhere. And you see, when you now have Minister of Interior being populistic all over Europe, thinking about 9 months ahead to the next election, we're never going to grapple with migration, which is a global issue as well explained by Trygve just on. And we're never going to be able to protect the few people that make it here because we have this politics of fear, security, and the very perceived populist attitude of European politicians. Because I say also perceived, and that's when I come back to the fact that we need to make our politicians responsible in the way that they lead on this issue. I think there have possibly been 2 exceptions during the last presidencies in the EU, Belgium and Sweden, that tried to bring forward what is called a common European asylum system. A very unholy alliance between Germany, Italy, France, and Great Britain. Great Britain usually never supports anything in the EU, especially not if it comes from France and Germany. But they wrote before the Belgians wanted to change the European asylum legislation that they wanted a full stop to this, even though it's been decided many, many, many years ago. Because if we had a common European asylum system, and it would include Norway, because Norway is no different, even though we're technically not members of the European Union. If we had a common European asylum system, then the European states didn't have to play this game with each other. And then you wouldn't have this downward spiraling of losing rights, being stricter, and making sure that you don't make yourself attractive as a state. This is what is referred to by political leaders as the pull effect. That's never been proven. People don't flee very easily. After the enlargement, with one exception of Great Britain, people didn't move from Latvia to all over just overnight, because people generally want to stay at home. But those few who can't, they will continue to flee, and they have to flee somewhere. And part of somewhere is the European Union, and including Norway. I'd like to tell you another anecdote, and this is slightly more philosophical. Is I had a chance a few years ago to visit the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. And, well, I grew up as a young man with my political first experience of apartheid and how bad that was, and I thought I knew about it. But what I didn't know was how well organized it all was. Amongst other things, you had an appeals board because you had 30 different races in South Africa. Well, everybody condemned apartheid, but at the same time there is a very, very peculiar logic to it. Because you had 30 different races that would decide where you could work, where you could live, where you could sit on the bus and so forth. And this would sometimes be unfairly done, so it would even split families from staying together. And then you could appeal to an appeals board to change your race. And every year, and there was a very due process, and it went through a directorate and then to a tribunal and so forth. And then every year between 3,000 to 6,000 people had their race changed. I'm not going to demonize those bureaucrats or those judges who made these decisions because they followed a very particular set of laws that we now look back at and say was madness, that we now look back at and say was inhuman. And I'm not going to say that Europe today is the same as apartheid either. But I think there's a danger that we're moving so far ahead with applying for asylum, being a migrant, setting up very complex migratory measures. If you want to come here, it will be difficult for your wife or your husband to come and so forth. That in 30 years people will look back and say, what were they thinking about? Why was this becoming such an enormous problem for such a civilized and rich and resourced place in the world as Europe? I told you some numbers, and if we refer to numbers, then it seems absolutely absurd that we have this very, very strict and security-focused policy in Europe today. But some of the problem, I think, is that the debate, and there was questions about this before, but I'll get back to it. The debate is not based on the facts any longer. The debate is not around the fact that people actually need protection. It's about very strong feelings or perceived feelings. You see it locally, nationally, and at the European level. Who can come here to Europe? Who can stay here and possibly even become citizens? Is the closest you get to the heart of this notion of the national state. I hosted a conference with the American ambassador to the European Union, and who was close to Obama, and he was saying, well, you've never gotten to the stage where you have these hyphen Europeans. As you say, I'm Irish American or I'm Haitian American. You can be both. In Canada as well, they're very, very good at that. You still see this as something that is absolutely incompatible with coming to Europe. Wait a generation, wait a couple of generations, and this will not be a problem. Equally, in Great Britain, they made surveys, big surveys every year, since the 50s, when they started having guest workers coming mainly then from the Caribbean. And between 80 and 90% of the population would say there's too many immigrants coming. It has nothing to do with numbers. There was just a notion, and some years there wouldn't be any immigrants coming at all before the refugees started. But at the same time, more than 60 to 70% says that migration has strongly contributed to the British society. This is what they're promoting now with their Olympics, of being multicultural. So there is a complexity in this that shouldn't be overlooked. And that's where I think we need to get back to, because we can't accept a Europe that is being so security focused, so half paranoid, so self-assured and self-protecting, that it threatens the very values that Europe was built upon. And that goes for all of us, as Europeans, not citizens, but all of us, because it says something about our identity for the future. And it says something about what sort of society we want to be for all of us as well. I will open for some questions, but I'd just like to quote Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi as well. Because he said at one point that what recognizes a civilization is how it treats the weakest in the society, how it treats the people it owes nothing to. And this is a real worrying sign for Europe in 2012, thinking we're the most civilized